The conference room smelled of old leather and fresh paper, the kind of place where important decisions were made and no one walked away completely happy. Mary sat stiffly in the chair, hands folded in her lap, trying to steady the restless tapping of her foot. She had been through enough lawyers' offices to know the drill: nod, sign, walk away with nothing. This was a formality, nothing more. Nolan had been a lot of things, but generous wasn't one of them. The lawyer, a man with graying hair and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here," he began, shuffling a stack of neatly stapled documents. "As we go through the terms of Mr. Nolan Thatcher's will, I ask that you hold any questions until the end." Mary barely heard him. Her focus was on Isla, sitting beside her, her small fingers curled around Mary's sleeve. Isla had no idea why they were here. She was only 5. To her, the large wooden table was just another surface to rest her chin on while she swung her legs in her too big shoes. Mary had debated leaving her at home with a sitter, but she had no one she trusted, and the last time she'd tried one of those app-based services, she had come back to find Isla eating peanut butter straight from the jar while an uninterested teenager scrolled on her phone. So, here they were. The lawyer droned on about assets and debts, none of which concerned Mary. Nolan had lived a life of wealth, but none of it had ever touched her. When he left, he did so cleanly, ensuring she and Isla received only what the court demanded. She prepared herself for the inevitable, a polite acknowledgement of her presence before moving on to the real recipients of Nolan's fortune. Then the lawyer said something that made her sit up. Per Mr. Thatcher's instructions, the trust fund set aside for his daughter, Isla Thatcher, will only be accessible under one condition. Mary's fingers tightened on Isla's sleeve. Condition? The lawyer hesitated, glancing at the sheet of paper as though it might offer him a way out of this. Yes. In order to claim Isla's rightful inheritance, you, Miss Thatcher, must enter into a legal marriage with Mr. Damon Thatcher, and remain married for a period of no less than 1 year. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt like the air had been pulled from it. Mary blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She was certain she had misheard. Mr. Nolan Thatcher stipulated that in order for the trust fund to be released for Isla's benefit, you and Mr. Damon Thatcher must be legally wed for a full year. Mary let out something between a laugh and a gasp. This had to be a mistake. Nolan might have been arrogant, selfish, and completely indifferent to the struggles she faced as a single mother, but he wasn't insane. She turned to the lawyer, her voice sharp. "Is this a joke?" "I assure you, it is not." Mary leaned forward. "You expect me to marry Nolan's brother?" The lawyer coughed delicately. "That is the condition." She shook her head, trying to process the absurdity of it. Damon and Nolan hadn't spoken in years. Damon had cut himself off from his brother's life so thoroughly that Mary hadn't even seen him at the funeral. The idea that Nolan had somehow decided they should be bound together was beyond ridiculous. Mary's heart pounded as she looked at Isla, oblivious to the weight of what had just been said. Isla, who deserved a future that wasn't dictated by her mother's empty bank account. "This is insane," Mary muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "You have the right to refuse," the lawyer said. "But in doing so, the trust fund will revert to an alternate beneficiary, chosen by Mr. Thatcher." Mary sat up straighter. "Who?" "I'm not at liberty to say." A sick feeling coiled in her stomach. Isla had always been second place in Nolan's life. Who was to say he hadn't left everything to some distant relative, or worse, to one of his business interests? She had no way of knowing if Isla would ever see a cent of what was rightfully hers. A slow dread settled over her. Then, before she could fully process it, the door to the conference room opened. A man walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Damon Thatcher had the same sharp jawline as his brother, the same piercing eyes, but where Nolan had been polished and showy, Damon was something else entirely. He carried himself like a man used to solitude, his presence both striking and unreadable. Dressed in dark gray, he looked more like a storm cloud than a grieving relative. He didn't acknowledge the other people in the room. His gaze swept past the lawyer, past Isla, and landed on Mary. She had not seen him in years. Not since before Isla was born. Back then, he had been a shadow in Nolan's life, always watching but never involved. Nolan had always spoken of him with disdain, calling him difficult, reclusive, a man who preferred blueprints to people. Mary had never quite known what to make of him. Now, standing across the table from her, he didn't look surprised. She exhaled sharply. "You knew about this." Damon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid his hands into his pockets and gave her a look that was unreadable. "Yes." Mary swallowed, the weight of the room pressing in. "And you're just, what? Going along with it?" There was a pause, then, in a voice that was as calm as it was unwavering, he said, "Yes." That single word set off something in her, something close to fury. "Why?" Damon tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter?" The way he said it, so detached, so unaffected, made her want to throw something. "Of course it matters," she snapped. "I haven't seen you in years. I don't even know you." He didn't flinch. "And yet, here we are." Her jaw clenched. Damon Thatcher had always been a puzzle, a man with a presence that made people take a step back. She had spent years wondering why he and Nolan had fallen apart, why a man who shared his name had cut ties so completely. And now, somehow, her life and Isla's future had been forced into the hands of a man she barely understood. She looked at Isla, then back at the lawyer. "And if I say no?" The lawyer hesitated. "Then the trust fund will go to the designated alternate." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't about her. This was about Isla, about giving her a life that wasn't dictated by struggle and uncertainty. She turned back to Damon, her pulse thrumming in her ears. He was watching her with an expression so calm it made her want to scream. "You don't seem surprised by any of this," she said, voice tight. Damon's lips barely curved, not quite a smirk, but close. "I'm not." Mary had been blindsided before. Nolan had been a master at that, springing surprises that left her scrambling to catch up. But this? This was something else. Across the polished table, Damon Thatcher stood with the same detached expression he'd had when he walked in, as though he had expected every word the lawyer had spoken. He hadn't flinched at the absurdity of it, hadn't demanded an explanation, hadn't even scoffed at the sheer lunacy of being tied, legally and publicly, to his brother's ex-wife. Instead, he had simply nodded, as if this was just another contract sliding across his desk. Mary's stomach twisted. She looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to share in her outrage. The lawyer was already stacking papers, his job done. Isla hummed quietly to herself, playing with a loose thread on her sleeve, blissfully unaware of the life-altering decision that had just been made for her. And then there was Damon, standing in the same dark suit, expression unreadable, acting as if agreeing to a forced marriage was no more disruptive than a change in dinner plans. Mary shoved her chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "That's it?" she demanded. "You're just going along with this?" Damon's gaze flicked toward her, calm and steady. "Yes." Her pulse pounded in her ears. No hesitation, no questions. Just, yes. Yes. She clenched her jaw so hard it ached. The lawyer cleared his throat, glancing between them. "If there are no further concerns, I'll have the contracts drawn up." "There are concerns," she snapped. "A lot of them." Damon remained still, his face betraying nothing. Mary turned to Isla, pressing a quick kiss to her temple. "Sweetheart, why don't you wait outside for a minute?" Isla looked up, curious. "Are you mad?" Mary forced a smile. "No, baby. Just grown-up stuff." Isla sighed, sliding off the chair with exaggerated slowness. Grown-up stuff is always boring. She wandered into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her. Mary rounded on Damon. What the hell is going on? Damon exhaled slowly, as if this conversation was inevitable. You heard the terms. Oh, I heard them just fine. What I don't understand is why you're fine with them. His expression didn't shift. Because it's necessary. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. Her hands curled into fists. Damon had always been like this, closed off, withholding, a man who only spoke when absolutely required. Nolan used to call him a control freak, said he needed blueprints and order in every aspect of his life. Now here he was, agreeing to something that made no sense, acting as though it was inevitable. Mary stepped closer, lowering her voice. Did you know about this? No. She searched his face for any sign of deception. Then why aren't you fighting it? A flicker of something passed through his eyes, too quick to name. He shifted slightly, a subtle movement, but she caught it. I don't fight battles I can't win, he said. Her breath caught. What does that mean? Damon didn't answer. Mary let out a short, humorless laugh. So that's it? You're just accepting that your dead brother set this up, and now we're supposed to be husband and wife like some twisted business deal? Damon tilted his head slightly. That's exactly what it is. Her chest tightened. You don't find that even a little disturbing? It doesn't matter what I find. Mary let out a sharp breath. He was impossible. Every answer was clipped, every response calculated. You hate Nolan. His expression didn't change, but she saw it, the barely perceptible shift in his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw. She pressed forward. You two hadn't spoken in years. Now, suddenly, you're just fine following his instructions from the grave? His jaw flexed. I don't have to like the terms to accept them. The words sent a chill through her. Mary crossed her arms. Why would he do this? Damon was silent. Did he know something we didn't? She pushed. Was this some last-ditch attempt to control our lives? Or was this about you? That got a reaction. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of something behind his carefully maintained exterior. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't random, was it? Damon's lips pressed into a firm line. The details don't change the outcome. She narrowed her eyes. No, but they sure as hell change whether or not I go along with this. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled. Nolan always got what he wanted. Mary frowned. What does that mean? Damon's voice remained steady, but there was something beneath it now, something she couldn't quite place. It means you should be asking yourself what refusing will cost you. Her stomach twisted. That sounds like a threat. It's a fact. She studied him, searching for cracks in the polished surface. He looked the same as he always had, controlled, detached, perfectly composed. But there was something else now, something she hadn't seen before. Regret. Mary swallowed hard. She had always thought of Damon as the quieter Thatcher brother, the one who had stepped out of the spotlight, uninterested in the wealth and power that Nolan had chased. She had never thought of him as dangerous. But now, standing in front of him, watching the way he held himself, she realized something unsettling. Damon Thatcher wasn't a man who did things blindly. If he was agreeing to this, there was a reason. She just had no idea what it was. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, flipping through the crisp pages of Nolan's will with a precision that made Mary's stomach tighten. The weight of the room had already settled on her shoulders, thick and suffocating, but there was something about the way he cleared his throat that made it worse. She braced herself. There is one more stipulation, he said, tapping the paper in front of him. In the event that Miss Thatcher refuses the marriage, the trust fund does not simply remain frozen. Mary's jaw clenched. She had spent the last few minutes considering exactly that, walking out of here, Isla's hand in hers, refusing to play along with whatever game Nolan had orchestrated. But the way the lawyer said it made her hesitate. He looked at her, expression carefully blank. If you do not agree to the terms, the trust will be transferred to an alternate beneficiary. The words sent a chill down her spine. She leaned forward. Who? The lawyer hesitated, and that was answer enough. She shook her head. No, I want a name. His gaze flicked toward Damon, then back to her. Mr. Thatcher designated an unnamed relative, someone outside of immediate family, to receive full control of the trust should you decline the marriage. Her heart pounded. So Isla gets nothing. That is correct. Mary exhaled sharply. She had expected this to be cruel, but even for Nolan, this was a new level of calculated. It wasn't enough to make it difficult, he had designed it to be impossible. She gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady the rise of panic. So if I say no, my daughter loses everything, and we don't even know who gets it instead? That's the situation. Mary turned to Damon, expecting him to look at least mildly disturbed by the revelation, but his expression was as unreadable as ever. The man had barely reacted to anything, and it was beginning to infuriate her. She forced herself to look back at the lawyer. And if I agree? What exactly does that mean? The lawyer folded his hands. The marriage must be legally recognized and maintained for a minimum of 1 year. You and Mr. Thatcher will be required to share a residence. After the 1-year term, the trust will be fully transferred to Isla, without restriction. She scoffed. So I just have to be Mrs. Damon Thatcher for a year, and then I'm free? A flicker of something, amusement, crossed the lawyer's face, but it was gone before she could be sure. Yes. Mary sat back, mind racing. Every logical part of her screamed to walk away, to figure out another way, to refuse to be manipulated from beyond the grave. But logic didn't change the reality, Isla's future was on the line. She glanced at Damon again. He hadn't moved, hadn't argued, hadn't said a single word to try and sway her in one direction or the other. It was maddening. Is there anything stopping him from refusing? She asked. Damon finally spoke. No. Her gaze snapped to him. But you're still willing to do it? Yes. She exhaled sharply. Why? Damon tilted his head slightly. Does it matter? Mary's nails dug into the fabric of her jeans. The lawyer pushed a set of documents across the table. If you're in agreement, we can finalize this today. Her fingers hovered over the papers. Her mind screamed that this was a mistake, but the image of Isla, small, innocent, deserving of more than her mother's stubbornness, kept her still. I want to be clear, she said finally. This is in name only. Nothing else. The lawyer nodded. Understood. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. And after a year, I can walk away? Yes. She let out a slow breath. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Fine. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the scratch of the pen as she signed her name. She pushed the document toward Damon. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't hesitation, not exactly, but something close. His fingers hovered over the page for a second too long, like there was something unspoken sitting between them, something she couldn't quite name. Then, without a word, he signed. A strange sensation crept up her spine, like an echo of something she didn't remember, a weight she couldn't place. It made her uneasy, as if this wasn't the first time she had sat across from Damon Thatcher, signing something that would change her life. The penthouse was the kind of place Mary had only ever seen in magazines, the kind where people had wine cellars even if they didn't drink, and decorative bowls filled with things that weren't meant to be eaten. It sat high above the city, floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across the entire living room, showcasing a skyline that seemed unreal. The furniture was modern and pristine, every surface polished, every detail meticulously curated. It was the opposite of everything she and Isla had ever known. Mary set their bags down near the entryway, feeling out of place before she had even taken off her coat. Isla, on the other hand, was already padding across the marble floor, peering around with wide-eyed curiosity. She had spent her whole life in spaces that were lived in, full of clutter and mismatched furniture, tiny apartments where walls were too thin and neighbors too loud. This, by comparison, was silent, cavernous, a place that looked like no one had ever laughed in it. "Where's all the stuff?" Isla asked, turning in a slow circle. "It looks like a hotel." Mary didn't have an answer. Damon walked in behind them, his presence shifting the air in a way that made her shoulders tense. He didn't look at her as he set his keys on the sleek black counter, moving through the space like he had already forgotten they were there. "I'll have someone bring in whatever else you need," he said, barely glancing in her direction. "There are extra rooms down the hall. You can choose whichever one you want." Isla's face lit up. "I get my own room?" Damon finally looked at her. "You get the biggest one." Mary stared at him. Isla beamed and immediately took off toward the hallway, disappearing into the massive space that was now apparently her new home. Mary folded her arms. "Bribing a 5-year-old with square footage. Nice move." Damon shrugged. "She deserves it." There was something about the way he said it that made Mary's stomach twist, but she ignored it. "And what about me?" she asked. "Do I get the biggest room too, or are you sticking me in a broom closet?" His gaze flicked toward her, unreadable as ever. "I assumed you'd want a room of your own." She scoffed. "That's the first thing you've gotten right today." Damon didn't argue. He just nodded toward the hallway. "Second door on the left." She should have been relieved. That was the deal, after all. Marriage in name only. No expectations, no blurred lines, nothing beyond the contract. But as she stepped deeper into the space, something gnawed at her, something about the way Damon moved through the penthouse like a man who had already lived in its emptiness for too long. The kitchen was spotless, the kind of place where no one actually cooked. But when she opened the cabinets, she stopped short. Tucked in the back of a shelf was a brand of tea she hadn't had in years, one she had stopped buying after Isla was born because it was too expensive, too indulgent for someone counting every penny. She reached for it, fingers brushing the box as her chest tightened. "Who drinks this?" Damon didn't look up from whatever he was doing. "You do." She turned, her grip on the box tightening. "I haven't had this in years." He leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "I know." Her pulse quickened. "How?" Damon didn't answer. She set the tea down slowly. "This place doesn't look like anyone actually lives here, and yet somehow, the one thing I used to drink every morning is sitting in your cabinet. That's not normal." He didn't react, didn't even blink. "It's just tea." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's not." Damon pushed off the counter and walked past her, pulling open a drawer with an ease that made it clear he was ending this conversation before it could start. But Mary wasn't done. "How do you know how I take my coffee?" she demanded. His shoulders tensed, just slightly, before he grabbed a glass and set it under the sink. She folded her arms. "Because you got it exactly right this morning, and I don't remember ever telling you. I don't remember you and I ever even having coffee together." Damon turned off the faucet, setting the glass down with careful precision. She swallowed hard. "And Isla. The way you said she deserves the biggest room." Her voice lowered. It sounded personal. Damon finally met her gaze. "Maybe it is." Her breath caught. This was what drove her crazy about him, the way he spoke in circles, the way he gave just enough to make her question everything but never enough to confirm anything. She took a step closer. "Did Nolan tell you things about me?" "No." Her fingers curled into fists. Then how do you know? Damon set the glass down and walked past her, moving toward the record player in the living room. She hadn't even noticed it before, sitting beside the massive windows, a collection of records neatly arranged next to it. It didn't fit the rest of the space, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Damon picked up a record, turning it over in his hands before sliding it onto the player. A moment later, the room filled with the warm hum of a jazz tune she knew by heart. She inhaled sharply. She hadn't played that song in years. She had danced to it in the kitchen of her old apartment, feet sliding against the linoleum floor, Isla giggling as she clapped along. It had been a piece of another life, a different version of herself, one that felt impossibly distant. She turned to Damon, her chest tight. "Where did you get this?" His expression didn't change. "It's yours." The words hit her like a punch. Damon watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to put something together, as if this, whatever this was, had already been written long before Nolan's will had forced them back into each other's orbit. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but the music played on, wrapping around them like a thread that had been unraveling for years. And for the first time since stepping into this penthouse, Mary had the distinct, uneasy feeling that she wasn't starting something new. She was stepping back into something she had simply forgotten. Mary had spent years being invisible to the kinds of people who now whispered her name over glasses of champagne in rooms lined with marble and money. Chicago's elite had always looked at her as an inconvenience, a footnote in Nolan Thatcher's life story, someone they acknowledged only when absolutely necessary. But now, she was something else entirely, a question without an answer, a mystery unfolding in real time. At a charity event, two women draped in designer dresses stood near the entrance, their voices just low enough to suggest secrecy but loud enough to be heard. "I don't understand it," one of them murmured. "Why would Nolan do this?" "Maybe she was never really in love with him," the other suggested, swirling the wine in her glass. "Maybe it was always Damon." The idea was scandalous enough to send a ripple through every event, every gallery opening, every dinner party where the name Thatcher was still currency. People loved a good love triangle, even if one of its participants was dead. Mary felt their eyes on her every time she walked into a room, but none of them dared to ask her directly. They whispered behind raised hands, dissecting every detail of her sudden marriage to a man who had spent years avoiding the very world they belonged to. Damon didn't seem to care. He moved through these events with the same detached ease as always, barely acknowledging the curiosity swirling around them. If he heard the whispers, he gave no indication. If he knew the theories being spun in every corner of Chicago's elite, he didn't dignify them with a reaction. It drove her insane. Late one night, unable to shake the feeling that something was being kept from her, Mary wandered through the penthouse, bare feet pressing against the cold floor as she made her way to Damon's study. She had never spent much time in this room. It was all dark wood and clean lines, bookshelves filled with volumes that looked like they had never been touched. The room felt as distant as the man who owned it. But something caught her eye. A desk drawer. Locked. She frowned, fingers grazing the surface. There was a small brass label attached to it, and when she leaned in closer, her breath caught in her throat. Her name. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Of course, it wouldn't. Whatever was inside, Damon clearly didn't want her to see it. She glanced toward the door, listening for any sign of movement. The penthouse was silent. Her mind raced. What could possibly be inside? A contract? A letter? Proof that this arrangement was even more twisted than she had already believed? She reached for a letter opener on the desk, sliding it into the small gap between the drawer and the frame, wiggling it just enough to see if she could force the mechanism. She wasn't proud of herself, but she was past the point of caring. Then a voice cut through the silence. "I wouldn't do that." She froze. Slowly, she turned. Damon stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that made the tension in the room unbearable. Her grip on the letter opener tightened. "What's in here?" He didn't answer. She exhaled sharply. "You have a drawer. With my name on it. Locked." "I'm aware." Her pulse quickened. "So, are you going to tell me what's in it?" Damon walked toward her, unhurried, every movement controlled. He didn't reach for the drawer, didn't rush to remove whatever was inside. Instead, he leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "It's not time yet." She stared at him. Not time for what? He just watched her, silent. Her skin prickled. She had spent enough time around powerful men to recognize when someone was holding all the cards. Damon wasn't denying that there was something inside the drawer. He wasn't pretending it wasn't important. But he was making it clear that she wasn't going to get an answer tonight. Anger burned in her chest. "You don't get to decide what I know," she said. Something flickered across his expression, something that almost looked like regret. Then, quietly, he said, "I already have." Mary barely slept that night. When she finally drifted into unconsciousness, it wasn't peaceful. She found herself in a dream, one that felt too vivid, too sharp around the edges. She wasn't in the penthouse anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere familiar but just out of reach, like an old photograph she couldn't quite place. The room was dimly lit, warm, the kind of place where people whispered secrets instead of speaking them aloud. She wasn't alone. A man was beside her, his presence solid, his voice low and rough against her ear. "I love you." The words sent a shiver down her spine, curling around her in a way that felt unshakable, undeniable. But something was wrong. The voice wasn't Nolan's. It was Damon's. Her eyes flew open, breath catching in her throat as she stared at the dark ceiling of her bedroom. The weight of the dream settled over her, heavy and relentless. She had spent years believing she knew her own story. Now, she wasn't sure anymore. Mary had spent most of her adult life surviving on instincts. When something felt off, it usually was. And right now, everything felt off. Damon was hiding something, that much was clear. The locked drawer, his refusal to answer, the dream that had left her gasping for breath in the dark, it all pointed to something she couldn't explain. She wasn't the type to let things go, not when every bone in her body told her there was more to this than she understood. Isla was asleep. The penthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin prickle. Damon had disappeared hours ago, no explanation, no mention of when he'd be back. Maybe he thought she would just drop it, let it all settle like dust in a forgotten room. But he didn't know her as well as he thought he did. She moved through the space slowly, her fingers trailing along the bookshelves in the study before making her way to the larger library down the hall. It was one of those rooms designed for aesthetics rather than function, massive shelves lined with perfectly arranged books, rich leather furniture that looked barely used. Mary wasn't sure what she was looking for. If Damon was keeping something from her, it wasn't going to be written out in some obvious letter labeled for Mary's eyes only. But people were careless, even the ones who thought they were untouchable. She scanned the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of books that hadn't been moved in years. Then something caught her eye. A book that wasn't quite aligned with the others, tucked slightly deeper into the shelf. It was a subtle difference, something someone else might have ignored, but she reached for it, pulling it forward. Nothing happened. But when she slid her hand into the empty space behind it, she felt something. Her breath hitched as she pulled out a book that didn't belong, a worn, faded photo album. The cover was soft from years of handling, the edges frayed. This wasn't something that had been placed here recently. It had been here for a long time, forgotten or maybe purposefully hidden. She hesitated for only a second before opening it. The first picture made no sense. It was her. Not her and Nolan, not her and Isla, but her and Damon. They were standing on a rooftop, the city sprawling behind them, both of them mid-laugh. She was wearing a dress she didn't remember owning, her hair slightly windswept, her hand resting on his chest like it belonged there. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next page. Another photo. Damon's arm was wrapped around her waist, his head tilted toward her like he had just whispered something in her ear. She looked happy. Not just smiling for the camera happy, but something else. Something deeper. Page after page, the same story unfolded. A story she didn't remember. Then she saw it. A picture of them, standing close, holding hands. She was wearing a white dress. He was in a suit. And on their fingers, rings. Her vision blurred. She slammed the album shut, her pulse hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She pressed a hand to her forehead, her breath coming too fast. Damon and Nolan had never been close. She had barely known Damon when she was with Nolan. There was no way, no possible way, this made sense. And yet, there were things she couldn't explain. The way Damon knew exactly how she liked her coffee. The way he had Isla's favorite stuffed animal in the guest room before she even mentioned it. The locked drawer with her name on it. She had thought she knew her own history. But maybe, just maybe, there were pieces missing. Mary barely remembered moving through the penthouse. 1 second, she was in the library, her hands shaking as she clutched the old photo album, and the next, she was storming into the living room, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air felt too thick, the city lights outside too bright, the entire world tilting beneath her feet. Damon was just stepping inside, his coat still draped over one arm, his phone in his other hand. He had the nerve to look surprised, though only for a moment. His eyes flicked to the album in her grip, and something in his expression shifted. She didn't hesitate. She threw it. The album hit his chest and fell to the floor, the pages fanning open like a wound splitting apart. The images scattered, her laughing in his arms, his hand on the small of her back, their wedding rings catching the light. Her voice trembled with fury. What the hell is this? Damon didn't pick up the album. He didn't crouch down and try to gather the photos or scramble for some weak explanation. He just stood there, his shoulders stiff, his face unreadable. But his silence wasn't the silence of someone caught in a lie. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Her stomach turned. He exhaled slowly, setting his coat down on the couch with careful precision. His jaw tensed before he finally met her gaze. You weren't supposed to find that yet. Her breath caught, her fingers curling into fists. The words knocked the air out of her chest, a slow, sickening confirmation of something she didn't even have the words for yet. She shook her head. I don't, her voice cracked. I don't understand. Damon didn't argue. He didn't rush to explain, to smooth over the edges of a reality that had just shattered beneath her feet. He just looked at her, his exhaustion seeping into every inch of his face. She felt the weight of it now. Not just the photos. Not just the fact that her own history was sitting in an album she had never seen before. It was in the way he had always known exactly how she liked her coffee. The way he had stood still when they signed their marriage license, hovering over the paper like it was déjà vu. Like it wasn't the first time. She swallowed hard. Were we married? Damon's gaze darkened, but he didn't move. He didn't answer. That was an answer all on its own. Mary stood frozen, the room around her fading into the background, reduced to nothing but static noise. The album lay open on the floor between them, the pictures staring up at her like ghosts from a life she didn't remember living. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, as if her body knew the truth before her mind could catch up. Damon ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion showing in the slight slump of his shoulders. He looked like a man who had carried something heavy for too long, and now, finally, he was setting it down. We were married, he said. The words weren't rushed or desperate. They were quiet. Steady. Unshakable. Mary blinked, her stomach twisting. That's not possible. His eyes met hers, and she hated what she saw in them. No hesitation. No doubt. Yes, it is. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in on her. She took a shaky breath. You're lying. I'm not. She shook her head. I would remember. His jaw tensed, and for the first time, something like pain flickered across his face. No, he said softly. You wouldn't. The words sent a shiver through her, cold and sharp. She forced herself to move, to pace, to do something other than stand there while the world tilted beneath her. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples. This doesn't make any sense. Damon watched her, his silence stretching between them like a wire pulled too tight. Then, finally, he spoke. You had an accident. Mary stopped. His voice was careful now, like he was stepping over broken glass. You don't remember because Nolan made sure you wouldn't. She swallowed, but her throat was dry. Damon's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He let you believe that he was the only one. That your life with me never existed. Her stomach twisted violently. That's insane. His eyes darkened. Is it? A memory hit her then, not a full picture, but the faintest thread of something, slipping through her fingers like smoke. A flash of headlights. A sharp pain at the base of her skull. The sensation of falling. Her breathing grew uneven. I was in a car accident. The words felt foreign in her mouth, like she was saying them for someone else. Damon nodded. She grasped at fragments that refused to come together. I woke up in the hospital. Nolan was there. Yes. She squeezed her eyes shut. He told me. Her voice broke. She had thought it was grief. Thought it was the shock of the accident, the medications, the trauma. But now it felt like something else. Damon stepped closer, but he didn't touch her. He didn't reach for her the way a husband might. He just stood there, waiting for her to catch up. He told me we had always been together, she whispered. The confirmation didn't come as a dramatic revelation. It wasn't shouted or gasped. It was just there, settling between them like an old truth finally uncovered. Damon exhaled, his voice rough. He lied. Mary let out a shaky breath, her hands dropping to her sides. She had spent years believing her life was one thing. That her love story was one thing. But now, staring at Damon, at the man who should have been a stranger but wasn't, everything unraveled. The worst part wasn't that she didn't remember. The worst part was that some small, hidden part of her had always known something was missing. Mary's stomach twisted violently, a nausea that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the realization clawing its way through her. She had loved Damon. Not Nolan. Damon. The man standing in front of her, the man who had been a stranger in her mind but was something else entirely in reality. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if she could stop the flood of emotions rising in her throat. None of this made sense. It couldn't be real. And yet the photographs, the memories just out of reach, the way Damon looked at her like she was something he had lost a long time ago, it was all proof she couldn't ignore. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She gripped the back of the couch for support, the cool leather grounding her. I married you, she whispered, testing the words. They felt foreign on her tongue, but something deep in her chest twisted at the sound of them. Not with disbelief. With something closer to recognition. Damon didn't respond. Her pulse pounded. And then I woke up in a hospital, and Nolan, she stopped, bile rising in her throat. She shook her head. No. No, that doesn't make sense. I would have remembered. Damon's jaw clenched, his silence thick with meaning. Her breath came short and uneven. I would have remembered you. Damon swallowed hard. You didn't. Mary inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening against the leather. You just let him take me? Her voice cracked. You let him stand next to my hospital bed and rewrite my entire life? Damon's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You knew I belonged with you, she choked out. And you didn't stop him? He flinched. The reaction was slight, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. Her anger exploded, sharp and unrelenting. How could you let him take me? Damon exhaled roughly, running a hand over his face, the first real sign that the weight of this moment was pressing into him as much as it was pressing into her. He looked at her then, and for a brief second, she saw something that made her chest tighten, grief. Deep and old, like he had been carrying it for years. I tried, he said, his voice rough. Mary let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You tried? His eyes darkened. You were unconscious, Mary. You had no memory. You didn't even recognize me. She shook her head, refusing to accept it. You woke up, he continued, voice low, almost hollow, and the only person you knew was him. Tears burned behind her eyes. So what? You just gave up. Damon's jaw tightened. You think it was that simple? Mary's breath hitched. You had a head injury, he went on, his voice raw with something she couldn't quite name. You were confused. Disoriented. And Nolan, he exhaled sharply. Nolan made sure you never had a reason to question the reality he built for you. Her chest ached. You should have told me. Damon's face was unreadable now, but the tension in his body was impossible to miss. You think I didn't want to? His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. You think I didn't fight for you in every way I could? Mary bit the inside of her cheek to keep her emotions from overflowing. Damon stepped closer, his voice lower now. You trusted him, Mary. You looked at me like I was a stranger. She swallowed hard. And he stopped, as if the words were too much. He shook his head. I couldn't force you to remember something you weren't ready to see. Mary squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit this truth into the shape of her life. But the truth was, her life had never belonged to her. It had been stolen. Damon's words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Because he said if I told you the truth, he'd ruin you. And I believed him. Mary barely felt the movement before her palm connected with his cheek. The sharp sound cracked through the room, startling even herself. Damon didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He stood there, taking it, his head only slightly turned from the force of the slap. His jaw clenched, his breathing steady, his face a canvas of guilt and something else, something she couldn't bring herself to name. Her hand stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the fire in her chest. You let him steal my life. The words came out raw, barely more than a whisper, but they cut through the space between them like a blade. Damon's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. I tried to protect you. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Protect me? Her voice rose, breaking on the last word. By leaving me with him? By letting me believe I had a life with Nolan when I didn't? She took a shaky breath, fury and devastation crashing into her all at once. You let me think I loved him. Damon's hands curled into fists at his sides. I didn't let you do anything. Mary shook her head violently, refusing to hear whatever justification he was about to give. You stood there and watched him take me. You let me marry him. The words felt like acid in her throat. Damon exhaled roughly, dragging a hand through his hair. You don't understand. No, she snapped. I don't. So explain it to me. Explain how you just let it happen. Damon's lips pressed into a thin line, his breathing measured, controlled. I didn't have a choice. Her stomach twisted. You always had a choice. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. You don't know what Nolan was capable of. She took a step closer, her hands trembling. And you think I was better off not knowing? Damon looked away. Something inside her cracked. God, I don't even know who you are. His gaze snapped back to hers, something sharp flashing behind his eyes. You did. She sucked in a breath, her body vibrating with anger. She couldn't look at him, couldn't stand in this space that suddenly felt too small, too full of history she didn't remember. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the door. Damon didn't stop her. And that, somehow, hurt the most. Mary barely felt the cold of the night air as she stepped onto the penthouse balcony. The city stretched out before her, a glittering expanse of lights and motion, but all she could feel was the weight of what she had learned. Damon had let her believe a lie. He had let Nolan steal her life, rewrite her memories, and stand beside her as if he belonged there. And worse, he had done nothing to stop it. Her hands were still shaking when she walked back inside. She couldn't sit still. The anger was too much, the betrayal too thick in her throat. She needed answers. She moved quickly, retracing her steps from earlier that night, back to the study. Damon's study. His perfectly curated, painfully controlled space. He had kept a drawer locked with her name on it. What else had he hidden? She pulled open cabinets, searched the bookshelves, ran her fingers along the edges of picture frames, desperate for something, anything, that could give her a piece of herself back. Then she saw it. A box, tucked inside one of the lower shelves, its surface worn with time. It was unmarked, unassuming, but something inside her knew. She dragged it out, her breath shallow as she lifted the lid. Letters. Dozens of them, some still in sealed envelopes, others folded and pressed together like they had been read 1,000 times. Her hands trembled as she pulled one free, the paper soft with age. And then she saw the handwriting. Her own. Her lungs squeezed. She unfolded the first letter, her name signed at the bottom in ink that had long since dried. The words blurred for a moment before settling into clarity. Damon, promise me we'll never let anyone come between us. Her throat tightened. If anything ever happens to me, don't let me forget. Please. Don't let me forget us. She covered her mouth with her hand, her whole body going cold. She pulled another letter from the pile, her fingers unsteady. I love you. In every lifetime, in every version of this world, I will always love you. Her breath hitched. She tore through the box, letter after letter, the truth pressing into her like a storm she hadn't been prepared for. She had loved him. She had chosen him. She had begged him never to let her forget. And he had let her. Damon had let her believe she was someone else. Her hands clenched around the papers, fury and grief colliding in her chest. He had kept these from her. He had let her live a lie. Mary stuffed the letters back into the box, her hands trembling. The edges of the paper were worn, creased in places that told her Damon had read them, maybe more times than she wanted to imagine. He had held on to her words, yet he had done nothing. Nothing to stop Nolan. Nothing to bring her back. He had kept these letters hidden while she had spent years believing a lie. She needed to get out. Her feet moved before her mind fully caught up. The weight of it all was too much, the letters, the photos, the truth that had shattered everything she thought she knew. She grabbed her coat, fumbling for her phone, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to take Isla and leave. It didn't matter where. Anywhere but here. She moved quickly down the hallway, pushing open Isla's bedroom door. The sight of her daughter, small and peaceful under the blankets, nearly broke her. Isla had no idea what had just happened, no idea that the life her mother had been fighting to hold together had never really belonged to her in the first place. Mary crouched beside the bed, brushing a hand over Isla's soft curls. Baby, Wake up, she whispered. Isla stirred, her face scrunching up in protest. Mama? We have to go, Mary said, keeping her voice steady even as her insides unraveled. Isla yawned, still half asleep. Where? Mary's throat tightened. Somewhere else. She stood, reaching for the duffel bag in the closet, shoving in a few clothes, Isla's stuffed rabbit, whatever she could grab. She had no plan, no idea where she would go, only that she couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in a house where Damon had let her believe she was someone she wasn't. She zipped up the bag, turned toward the door, and nearly screamed. Damon stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his broad frame blocking the exit. He didn't say anything at first, just took in the scene before him. The packed bag. Isla, rubbing her eyes, confused. Mary, breathless, furious. Move, she snapped. His gaze didn't waver. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking just fine, she shot back. Now get out of my way. Damon exhaled slowly, stepping fully into the room. Where are you going? She lifted her chin. Away from you. His jaw tightened. And how exactly are you planning to do that? I'll figure it out. With what money? Her stomach twisted. She hated that he was right. Hated that he knew she had no savings, no way to pay for a hotel, no job lined up because she had spent the last few weeks trapped in this mess Nolan had orchestrated. Damon studied her, his voice quieter when he spoke again. I won't stop you from leaving. She blinked, surprised, but he wasn't done. But you can't take Isla. The words hit like a slap. Her grip tightened around the bag. She's my daughter. She's also legally a Thatcher. His voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. And if you disappear with her, you'll be fighting a custody battle with a family that has more power and money than you do. Panic tightened in her chest. You think Nolan left loopholes? Damon asked. That he didn't make sure she was tied to this family no matter what happened? Mary's hands shook. I'm not trying to trap you, he continued, softer now. But you are trapped, whether you want to admit it or not. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. I can't stay here. Damon hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Then you need to know everything before you go. She eyed it warily. What is that? He held it out. She didn't take it. Damon exhaled. It's a police report. Mary's fingers curled into her palms. His gaze stayed on her, steady, unreadable. Your accident wasn't an accident. Her breath hitched. Damon took a step closer, his voice quiet. Nolan caused it. The room spun. She shook her head, refusing to believe it. Damon opened the folder, pulled out a page, and handed it to her. Read it. Her hands trembled as she took it. The words blurred at first, her mind refusing to make sense of them. But as she forced herself to focus, the truth sank in. The accident had been investigated. Witnesses had reported a second car, one that had run her off the road. The vehicle was registered to one of Nolan's companies. A cold shudder ran through her. She looked up at Damon, her voice barely above a whisper. He did this to me? Damon nodded, something haunted in his expression. And then he made sure you forgot. Mary felt her knees weaken, but she didn't fall. She couldn't. Because none of this was over. Mary couldn't breathe. The words on the police report blurred as she clutched the paper with shaking hands. The room felt too small, pressing in on her from all sides. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to move, to run, to do something, but she was frozen in place, trapped by the truth staring back at her in black and white. Nolan had done this. The accident that stole her memories, that fractured her life, that left her in a haze of confusion, he had orchestrated it. And then, like a thief in the night, He had stepped into the wreckage and rewritten history. Her stomach lurched. She barely made it to the bathroom before she doubled over the sink, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind refused to settle. Images clashed and tangled, flashes of a life she couldn't fully remember, the dreamlike haze of waking up in the hospital, Nolan sitting by her bedside with a carefully crafted expression of grief and concern. His voice, calm and reassuring, telling her how lucky she was. How much he loved her. How they had always been together. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. It was all a lie. Damon had been the truth, and Nolan had taken that from her. A sob clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't fall apart now. Not when the past was coming at her like a freight train. She stumbled back into the bedroom, the police report still clutched in her hand. Her pulse hammered as she looked around, her eyes darting between the suitcase she had packed, the sleeping form of Isla, and the bedroom door leading to the man who had kept this truth from her. She needed to see him. No. She needed him to see her. The hallway felt endless, stretching before her like a tunnel. Each step was heavy, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Damon was in his study, leaning against his desk, his face shadowed by the dim light of the room. He looked up the moment she entered, his gaze locking onto her like he had expected this. Maybe he had. She didn't stop until she was right in front of him, shoving the report against his chest. His fingers closed around the edges of the paper, but he didn't look down. He just kept his eyes on her, waiting. Say it. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His jaw tightened. Mary. Say it. His exhale was slow, deliberate. Nolan did this. The confirmation sent a shudder through her. Her hands curled into fists. And you knew. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Yes. Her breath hitched. She had been angry before, furious, betrayed, desperate to claw her way out of this nightmare. But this was different. This was fear. She took a step back, her stomach twisting. You let me live with him, she said, her voice trembling. You let me believe. Damon's expression darkened. I didn't let anything happen. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. You knew he did this to me, and you still let me believe I loved him. His breath came out uneven. I tried to tell you. You didn't want to hear it. Mary's heart pounded. I didn't want to hear it because he made sure I wouldn't believe you. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She swallowed hard. Why didn't you fight harder? Damon's eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering behind them. Because I thought keeping you safe was more important than making you remember me. A chill ran down her spine. Safe. As if remembering him would have put her in danger. Her pulse hammered. What aren't you telling me? Damon hesitated just long enough for panic to claw its way up her throat. The truth wasn't finished unraveling. And whatever came next, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Mary had spent years believing she knew the shape of her own life. The edges were rough, worn down by struggle, but it had been hers. Now, she wasn't sure what was real. Damon stood before her, his face unreadable, his body tense. His presence filled the room, heavy with things unsaid. He had loved her, at least, that was what the letters and photographs told her. But love and obsession were neighbors, weren't they? She had no way of knowing which side of the line Damon had been standing on all these years. She swallowed hard, the words sharp on her tongue. Did you ever stop loving me? Damon's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. No. A chill ran down her spine. Did you wait for this? She whispered, barely able to hear herself. Did you wait for Nolan to die just so you could have me back? His jaw tightened. It wasn't like that. Then what was it? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I never stopped protecting you. Mary let out a shaky laugh, bitter and exhausted. Protecting me? Damon, you let me believe I was someone else. You think I wanted that? His voice was low, almost rough. You think I stood by and watched because I wanted to? She shook her head, trying to keep the anger steady even as something deeper, something more dangerous, curled in her chest. Damon walked to his desk and opened a drawer. He pulled out a thin folder, holding it for a moment before handing it to her. You need to see this. She hesitated before snatching it from his hands, her pulse pounding as she flipped it open. The air left her lungs. Inside were documents. Reports. Emails. A plan, carefully constructed, laid out in excruciating detail. Nolan had been preparing to disappear. With Isla. Her hands trembled as she read the notes. Bank accounts moved offshore. Passports falsified. The name Isla Thatcher written in looping ink, over and over. She pressed a hand to her stomach. This can't be real. Damon's voice was controlled, but she heard the edge beneath it. He knew that if you ever remembered, if you ever questioned what he'd done, he wouldn't be able to keep you. So he made sure he'd still have her. Her vision blurred. She had never really been Nolan's, but Isla had been. At least, in his mind. And now, it was clear, he had been prepared to do whatever it took to keep his version of the story intact. She had been a pawn in his obsession. Damon's voice softened. I couldn't risk pushing you, Mary. If I had told you everything too soon, he would have taken her. And there wouldn't have been a damn thing I could do to stop it. She closed the folder slowly, her hands still unsteady. Damon took a step closer. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. Her breath caught. But before you do, he said carefully, I want you to remember. She frowned. I won't ask you to love me, he said. I won't ask you to stay. But I will ask you to remember who we were before you decide what we are now. She stared at him, her heartbeat unsteady. Let me help you piece it together, he said quietly. Then, if you still want to walk away, I'll let you. Something inside her cracked open. She didn't trust him. Not entirely. But she didn't trust herself either. Not when the past had been taken from her, rewritten, erased. So she nodded. Just once. Damon exhaled, something unreadable in his expression. And then the memories began. The record spun slowly on the turntable, the needle crackling softly before the music came through, warm and low. The jazz filled the penthouse, curling around Mary like an old memory she couldn't quite place. She hadn't meant to play it. She had been searching for something else, maybe a distraction, maybe clarity, but her fingers had hovered over the vinyl, and before she could second-guess herself, she had set it in motion. The melody tugged at something deep inside her, something beyond reason or logic. It wasn't just music. It was a thread leading somewhere she had been before. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. And then, Damon's presence, solid and quiet. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, still, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. The usual restraint was there, the careful control he always wore like armor, but beneath it, something else flickered. She didn't speak. Neither did he. She looked back at the turntable, the song playing on. A sudden rush of dizziness hit her, but she didn't sway. The memory came not in fragments, not in blurred images she had to chase, but in full, vivid detail, as if a curtain had finally been lifted. Wind whipping through her hair. The scent of salt in the air. A cliffside at sunset, the ocean stretching out endlessly behind them. She saw herself standing there, wearing white, her hands clutching Damon's. The moment felt suspended in time, untouched by the years that had come after. His voice, low and steady, whispering against her skin. Always find me. Her breath hitched. The memory crashed over her, so clear, so real, that it knocked the air from her lungs. She gasped, gripping the edge of the table. Damon moved toward her, his brow furrowed. "Mary." She looked up, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I remember." His whole body tensed. She swallowed, pressing a hand to her chest, as if she could steady the heartbeat pounding wildly beneath her ribs. "I wasn't his," she whispered, almost to herself. "I was never his." Damon's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Mary exhaled sharply, a breath she felt like she had been holding for years. She had spent so much time fighting against something she didn't understand, resisting truths she couldn't grasp. But now, there was no denying it. She had always been Damon's. A new kind of urgency settled over her, one she didn't question. She left the room without another word, her steps quick but steady. In the back of the closet, tucked behind unworn dresses and coats, was the garment bag she had barely noticed when she first moved in. She hadn't thought about it, hadn't even wondered why it was there. But now she knew. With careful fingers, she unzipped it. The dress inside wasn't exactly the same. She had altered it, changed parts of it without even realizing what she had been doing. But the bones of it, the shape, the fabric, the memories stitched into every thread, were unchanged. She slipped into it, smoothing her hands down the bodice. Her reflection in the mirror didn't feel foreign. It felt right. She stepped out onto the rooftop, the city stretching wide around her. The air was cool against her skin, the sounds of traffic far below nothing more than a distant hum. Damon was already there, waiting. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for the first time, his control shattered. His face froze, his breath caught, his entire body going still as he took her in. Mary stepped closer. "This time," she whispered, "I remember." His hands trembled at his sides. She reached for him, fingers curling around his. Damon exhaled a shaky breath, his forehead pressing against hers. She closed her eyes, the moment stretching, holding. The music drifted up from below, the same song playing, the same melody that had always belonged to them. And as he pulled her into his arms, as they moved together in the soft glow of the city lights, she whispered the only word that had ever mattered. "Always."